In this episode, we talk about scapegoats, vessels, and a thief. Here we go. In this episode of Cwic Media, Come Follow Me, we're going to cover 1 Thessalonians. This is perhaps the oldest epistle and the oldest writing period that we have of the New Testament. Remember that as we go through the New Testament, we're not reading this in the sequence of time, right? Especially the epistles from Paul. They're all over the place, mostly written and placed first by size, the length of the epistle, and then going toward the end and going eventually to Hebrews, which is very questionable as to whether it is written by Paul. But all of the writings in the New Testament do not follow some kind of a chronological order of when they were written. Thessalonians here, 1 Thessalonians, was written before any of the Gospels were written, at least as we can tell. The oldest manuscripts that we have from the Gospels all post-date 1 Thessalonians. So very possible we're getting the very earliest writing here in the entire New Testament. Now, Thessalonica is a major city in Greece. So most of the cities that we're looking at here are between Asia Minor and Greece. Thessalonica was founded in the time of Alexander the Great. It was named after his half-sister. And as time goes on here throughout the 1st century, 2nd century, and beyond, when the church is formed together into the universal church or the Catholic Church, eventually through the creeds of the 4th century, it eventually is going to split with the split of the Roman Empire. And you end up with the Western Church or the Catholic Church, the Roman Church, and with the Eastern Church, which eventually splits off into two. You have the Eastern and what they call the Oriental sects of Christianity. And we don't hear a whole lot about those churches. They're very interesting. And we actually have quite a few doctrines that are very similar to the Eastern churches. They're also split up oftentimes ethnically. So you have the Greek church, the Russian church, the Serbian church, the Church of Ukraine, etc. But it's a very large group. And it's estimated that there's approximately 400 million members of these Eastern churches. But that's where Thessalonica is going to end up. It's going to end up as one of these Eastern churches, or a part of these Eastern churches. These Eastern Orthodox churches are, to me, very interesting. They're very into symbolism, a lot of artwork, very similar in that sense to the Catholic Church. They have some doctrine that is different from the Catholic Church. They actually believe in theosis. They believe in becoming divine or sharing somehow some divinity with God. And just a few months ago, my family and I went to a Greek Orthodox service, which was very interesting. In the Greek Orthodox service, you're standing almost the entire time. So we're standing up, singing at times, listening to the priest at times, and then you sit down every once in a while, but the majority of about an hour or more is spent standing up. So if you ever do visit a Greek Orthodox church, just realize you're probably going to be standing for a while. But we had a great experience. I'm going to take you right down to verse 6 of chapter 1 here, where again, and Paul is doing this on purpose, I think. He starts off with talking about imitation. He uses that term followers in English, which in the Greek is mimetai, to mimic. He says here, and ye became followers of us and of the Lord, having received the word in much affliction with joy of the Holy Ghost. So this is a very important concept because Paul, throughout his epistles, talks about people being imitators of him and of the Lord. And who else would they be imitators of? Well, outside of the church, outside of Christ, you'd be imitators of the Greeks or the Gentiles or the pagans. And that's a completely different way of life. A different way of life in the sense that It is not about forgiveness. It is not about love at its core in its religion, but it's actually eventually about violence. And so Paul, as he's preaching the gospel, is saying, look, you need to imitate Christ and what he did. He overcame everything, which is really at its core the violence of the world. He overcame everything by submitting and by not retaliating, but only offering love. And so he offered a perfect life as an example, number one. And number two, he gave up everything, including his own life, and paid the price for everybody else through love. And so he's saying, imitate that, become imitators of him. I imitate him. I try to imitate him. So imitate us as leaders as well. Follow what we're doing because we are following Christ. And that's a big part of what I describe as the fluid hierarchy, right? We're trying to bind ourselves through imitating this specific path that is tied together like a link, a chain of links that continually moves forward. But there's a prescription for that progress. And that is the principles of the gospel that are exemplified in Christ and especially in his sacrifice. But it says here in verse 6 that the people of Thessalonica received the word in affliction. And so what is happening there to them is that the Jews, not the Jewish members, but the Jews that are there, see the Christians here as competition. They are rivals. And so they are persecuting them. And in fact, the persecution gets so bad that when Paul is here on his second journey, his second missionary journey, he and Silas have to leave. There's always such a battle to get the truth out there, especially when something is starting. Think of the early days of the church. Left and right, there are problems and struggles. It just doesn't end. And you have to have someone like Paul that is willing to go through all of this at great, great personal cost and great love and duty, a sense of duty to be able to try and keep all these things together. Just like Joseph Smith. There might have been people that in some ways could have done a better job of leading the church, but there may have been nobody better that was willing to go through everything that Joseph Smith had to go through, that it was willing to pay the price that he did and still have the energy and focus and the love of the people to keep things going. Then down in verse 9, just a little nuance on something we've covered many times before. And how ye turn to God from idols, it says, to serve the living and true God. Think about some of the things that people are turning away from when we talk about the idols, right? It is a way of life. It is a way of thinking. You're talking about a vain idol, a dumb idol, and something where there is no example of love. There's an example of authority, but of true give everything you have love that Christ gave for everyone doesn't exist. And so when you accept that as the one true God in your life, what you're saying is, I accept that love from him and I want to try and be like him. That is a big, big change in thought. And the pagan societies around this time don't recognize that, right? They're not familiar with that. This is an entirely new concept to them. Sacrifice to them meant giving up something like an animal or killing a person even for the sake of the group, for the community, for the sake of their family. But to sacrifice yourself, be the same way that you're going to give up everything, and to think that God himself gave up everything, was not a rival to you in some way, playing a game, that is a very, very different thought to what the pagans here had been taught to believe previously. And then in chapter 2, he goes through a very interesting point that is something we can recognize when we are dealing with people, especially with something as important as the gospel or what we worship. And that is here starting in verse 3. He says, for our exhortation, talking about him and Silas and Timothy, the leaders of the church, was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. So he's pointing out that this is a very important point, that you might receive information, you might receive principles, you might receive persuasion from a lot of different areas. But is it done sincerely? And it's probably a good idea to develop that skill and try and figure out when you're listening to somebody, could be a salesperson, is there sincerity there or is there guile? In verse 4, he follows up and says, but as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. So that's interesting, right? In other words, he's going to speak some hard things. They're going to say some difficult things. You could go out and just say things that sound good to everybody. Think of things that happen today, now, where, wow, the brethren could definitely at General Conference make some people feel a lot better sometimes by simply capitulating to a message that is more politically correct. But that's not their job, and they're not there for guile. That would be deceitful for them to do that. So they're putting a message out, at least efforting to continually put a message out that is without guile, and that is sometimes going to be harsh. It's like Nephi says about his brothers, Laman and Lemuel. Sometimes the truth cuts deep, and sometimes we need that. Sometimes we need to hear that. But we want truth. Where are we going to go for truth? He says here that God tries our hearts. So he's not always going to give us messages that sound pleasing to us. And right here in 14, he talks about how the people of Thessalonica have become followers, imitators of other churches in the areas down in Judea, for example. And that they also, just like those that are down in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas in Judea, have suffered because of what Paul came out of as a Pharisee. We came out of the climate of the Jews and the Christians here and the chasm between them. Just as they have suffered there, in Thessalonica, they're also suffering because of the same thing. And he says here in 15, talking about the Jews, he says, who both killed the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us, and they please not God and are contrary to all men. So what are they doing? So they have been killing the prophets. Go back to Isaiah and others that have been killed. Lehi, right, was going to be sacrificed. They were going to kill him. Why? It's not just because we would look at this as black and white, where Lehi's good and the people in Jerusalem are bad. Why are they doing it? Yes, they're evil, but what has made them evil? What has changed? They're doing it in what they believe is a moral cause, right? They need to sacrifice Lehi and stone him essentially for blasphemy so that they can show that they are right and that their moral code that they have absorbed at that time is correct. It's the same thing in the time of Jesus, right? They are saying that Jesus is not innocent. He's not some innocent guy that we're going to sacrifice. He's guilty to them. He's guilty of blasphemy and guilty of many other things. That's why they couldn't stand when you could see the fruits of his labor, all the healing that he did. They couldn't stand it because that's not their words, and that went against everything that they said about him. He was set up as a sacrifice because he was guilty according to the Jews. And that's how society worked. But of course, he wasn't guilty. But that's how it was with the prophets of old as well, Lehi included. They had to be sacrificed based on a moral code that was understood and accepted and adopted and probably lied about by everybody, that these victims were guilty. And so blasphemy was a great way to bring about that guilt. And that's not just among the Jews, that's among all societies. Then I want to skip over here to chapter 4. And we get this idea from Paul over and over again about our bodies. He uses the metaphor of a body for the church constantly. And then he talks about personally each one of our bodies as a temple, as the tool that our spirit is using, as an adversary to us because the body is carnal, and as a vessel to hold our spirit for us to purify. So he says here in verses 3 and 4, "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification, that ye should abstain from fornication, that every one of you should know how to possess his vessel," or your body, "in sanctification and honor." So I like how he comes out with that look, it puts us into a situation where we understand we're in a different place than we were in the premortal life. Here we are in mortality. We've each been given a body. And the body isn't us, in a sense, right? Really, it's our spirit, and then our spirit is housed in this body. But the body is our vessel, and it's what gives us our emotion, what gives us context in many ways in this world, pain and pleasure, etc. It's what helps us make sense of the world, our senses and our understanding of the world. But it is a temple, and really it is the temple. And I've said this before, but I think that the way Paul talks about the body seems to me that what he's saying is, look, the temples, for example, the temple in Jerusalem at this time with Paul is, our bodies aren't like that temple, right? That temple is like our bodies. Our bodies are eternal. Our bodies are what hold our spirit. The temple in Jerusalem is going to be brought down here within about 20 years of this time, of when Paul writes this. But our spirits and our bodies are eternal. They are the true temples. And so here he brings up fornication, but think about a temple and how it's treated. How we are so meticulous about how the grounds are. We're so meticulous about how clean the temple is at all times. The carpets are redone and replaced consistently. The angles of the doorways and everything are set just perfect. And nothing but the best is put inside of them. Things that bring the spirit. And so when we think about that, I think we should think more about not just what do we consume, not just about the word of wisdom, but looking at everything that our body senses around us and what world it is that we're creating. How are we keeping this body clean? What is our diet like? What do we really eat? Right? What are we really putting in there? Are we putting in the cheapest, worst stuff? And would we do that with your closest temple by you? Would that bring the spirit to the temple? And then, of course, we can talk about what we see and what we hear. All of these things are being absorbed into our body, which is an intelligent vessel. And it does change based on the experiences that we have and what we allow in, what we're putting into our bodies. So as Paul says here, we should sanctify and honor our bodies, our temples. And then over in chapter 5, verse 2, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night." We've heard that. And what does that mean? So again, I think what we have here, they may be thinking that the Lord is going to come a second time very soon. And I think a lot of what Paul talks about here, as well as what John talks about in the book of Revelation, has as much to do with what's about to happen in Jerusalem in 70 AD, about 20 years from the time of this epistle, and about 40 years after the time of Christ, as it does with us in the latter days. And I think we can see that in Matthew, where the sections that we have in Matthew in the Pearl of Great Price. We You can see two different time periods, but I think if you look between the time period now when Paul is talking and a future date from now when the Christ is coming for a second time, what we have in between there is a principle. And that is that we should all be looking forward to when Christ comes, because he will come as a thief in the night. So how do we need to live our lives? No matter where we find ourselves in that timetable, are we prepared? And again, he goes into this principle a little bit more in verse 3. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. So all's well in Zion, right? All's well in Zion. You know, it's interesting. I work a lot with the market, with the stock market. And sure enough, every time that everybody is really high on the market, right? At some point there, may not be now, obviously didn't happen 6 months ago, it might not be next year, but at some point when everybody's saying, hey, peace and security and safety and everything's great, then boom, right? Then you don't have that. Then you have chaos and destruction. So there's a principle to follow there that says, where do I place my risks? How much risk do I put out there? And in a spiritual sense, how am I invested in my own life and in the life of my family to absorb those times and to prepare myself for the second coming? And he says, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, and travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. When that time comes for a woman, that time comes, and you better be ready, right? Especially back then, because you're not going to change the timing on this. The Lord has his own time, and society and its patterns and its cycles and the economies, they all have their own laws that they're following, and we're not going to change that. And then down in verse 9, a very good principle for all of us to always remember, hopefully. For God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation by our Lord Jesus Christ. So we are created with the idea that we are going to be saved and that we're going to return successful, victorious. That's the whole idea for you, for me, for everyone. That's an important thing to understand, especially for them back then. That's not necessarily what they understood, these Gentiles, Greeks, pagans, in the world that they lived in. They were complete puppets to the gods. But we know, based on the love that God has for us, that we can count on, that we can trust, that we have faith in, that the Lord wants us to succeed. And that means a lot. Then down in 14 and 15, he's talking about giving service and being a servant to those around you. Again, servant is a big theme and a title, I think, a role that the Savior played and that we're all supposed to play. But in 15, he says something important. He says, see that none render evil for evil unto any man. So an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that is justice, but it's justice in a vacuum. It's sitting on its own, and it doesn't work. In fact, justice only creates more wrath and more problems because we're going to create enemies. We're going to create rivals. And things start spinning out of control, and wars start, contention starts, death starts, murder, robbery. All of this chaos ensues as we render evil for evil. If we live in a place where we're going to always offer revenge. And that's the exact opposite of what Christ taught, which was love your enemies. It's a difficult teaching, very difficult teaching. But it takes that cycle that's running out of control and spiraling downward, and it saves it. And it tries to bring it back through love and mercy, one to another. And so when we talk about how justice is going to take each of us down on its own, and we need the mercy of God to lift us up and to save us, we need the same thing as a society. You can think about political parties right now and how difficult things are becoming right now in a very contentious society. One side against the other, and this person said this, and we need to retaliate here, and it just doesn't stop, and the stones keep being hurled back and forth. Well, what does that end up being? Think about the end of the book of Ether, how that ends. not so great. The point of that book and the end of that book is to say, look, when you only focus on justice and you create rivals and enemies and you retaliate in kind over and over again, back and forth, you're going to start spiraling out of control. And in many ways, in many times, it's going to get to a point like it did in the book of Ether, where everybody is wiped out and there's death and carnage and evil everywhere. But that's not the way that the Lord taught. The way that the Lord taught is exactly the opposite. And then he gives a list of behaviors. Again, he loves giving us these lists of how we should act. And it's great to look at because we can read it over and over again, try to absorb it, maybe put it into our subconscious so that we behave better and we behave more Christ-like. But here in 17, he says, pray without ceasing. We hear that in the Book of Mormon also. And I think one way to look at that is not only are you supplicating to the Lord constantly, not only are you humbling yourself and submitting yourself to a greater power consistently, but it's understanding what your place is in mortality. Again, all of these things going on, you don't have control over. There are, so many rules and laws here where you have no control over it. Prayer comes from the same root as precarious, right? We live in a very precarious world where we just don't have control on many things. Now, we want to gain as much control in the right places as we can through our agency, but understanding that we don't have complete control and leaning on the Lord and putting faith in him, I think is a pretty good principle. And I think that's what that means. If you're in a state of prayer non-ceasingly, then you're always in a state where you're like, okay, I'm binding myself to someone who does have control. In 21, we get this suggestion from Paul. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. And again, I think that my personal experience is I've seen a number of times in the church, and here I am judging, but where we don't prove all things, where it almost seems like it's blasphemy to question something or to think about something critically on your own. And I think that's exactly what Paul is saying here, is no, you need to prove things to yourself or try things. That's what Alma tells us. Right? Just take that seed, no matter what the new thing is, the new doctrine, the new thing that you've learned, the new thing you've heard from the brethren. Take that seed and nurture it and help it to grow and try it, prove it. And then as you do that, that seed will grow and grow and grow and bear fruit. If you don't try it, then that tree is going to snap in half when the first wind comes. So we should prove things. Not contentiously and not negatively, right? You don't have to be contentious and negative to question something, especially with yourself, just to yourself. You can question something and then go and learn and go and try it and go and prove it. That is the best way to learn. I don't think that the Lord wants us to just listen and go, right? He doesn't want that. You think about the great teaching about obedience, which is in the book of Moses, where Adam is sacrificing. And an angel comes to him and says, well, why are you sacrificing? And he says, I don't know. I was told to do this, and so I'm doing it. It's like, okay, that's great. Obey. You obey. You go ahead and you obey. But he still wants to know why. And the angel tells him at that point. He doesn't go on living not ever wanting to know what is going on. I think that's important, especially in today's internet age. We need to inoculate ourselves against false doctrines and flattery words and ideologies that can take over our lives. And we do that through knowledge and practice. And then in 22, we get something that we usually read incorrectly. And here in 22, it says, abstain from all appearance of evil. So we oftentimes take this without really learning it and use it as a teaching idea of don't look like you're doing something evil, right? You take on the appearance of doing something that is evil, which is a good principle, but that's not what Paul's talking about, right? And we can extend that and we kind of put that out even further into getting a little bit more pharisaical on our behavior or a little more judgmental of those that are around us. But it's not even what Paul is saying. What is he saying here? Abstain from all appearance of evil. Well, the better translation of this is abstain from every form of evil, right? The appearance of how that evil is, not how you look doing something. That has nothing to do with it. It's abstain from every form of evil, pornography, thievery, blasphemy, etc. Looking at it the other way is a way for us just to get more judgmental with each other. So Paul and his companions, teaching the people of Thessalonica, do so in a way where they have no guile and they have complete sincerity. It's important for them to deliver a pure message. And the message that we hear in the gospel is not always one that is going to be pleasing to us. That's not the goal. Sometimes it's going to cut a little bit, and that's okay. What we want to do is try and imitate the leaders of the church who are trying to imitate Christ and follow that path that is built by charity and love, staying away from other idols that would detract us from a world where we love our enemies and we don't spiral out of control by creating rivalries. And these experiences that we have in trying to be righteous are all done within this body that we have been given, a temple that we are trying to create throughout our mortality and try to make it the right vessel, the type of vessel that it's supposed to be. And reading Paul, you can kind of hear him speaking directly to each one of us on these attributes, these Christ-like attributes that we should follow, that would all prepare us for an eventual second coming of the Lord, which, if we're not around when that happens, we will eventually meet him again. I'll talk to you next time.